to make sure I can make these slides work. I also want to say thank you so much to Arisa for joining us this evening. And Arisa, if you would care to introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about Not Another Child, and perhaps, you know, an initial takeaway for the audience this evening about what it's like to be the founder and the executive director of a new nonprofit.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Orisa Napa-Williams. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I founded Not Another Child in 2007 after the murder of my son. And this organization has really transpired through the years. We provide unconventional therapeutic services for gun violence prevention and intervention organizations, as well as a gamut of programs and services on our own. I think one of the takeaways that I would give today is about moving out an emotion to start an organization, opposed to sitting back and kind of gathering all of the information of what it takes to have and to run an organization. So Neil, I'll turn it back to you. And I'll be back.
Thank you, Arisa.
You're welcome.
That's a perfect start, actually, because one of the first things that we want to do here is just pause on this slide. This is possibly one of your major takeaways from this presentation. This is kind of the checklist, the step-by-step issues list of what you would actually have to try to accomplish if you were looking to literally start a new not-for-profit organization. I do want to take the time to talk about some of the kind of preliminary work, as Arisa just mentioned, which is so important because it's not only going to help you understand whether or not, as the Assemblywoman was indicating, this is actually something you should do, create a new organization, or if there's another way that you can go about being of help, being of use, and you know, fulfilling the mission in some fashion. But it's also a kind of reference point here for you to go back and see what all is involved in the creation of a new organization, and therefore it's not just setting it up, it's maintaining it as you go forward. So just as pause here, I've captioned this slide as kind of the two-step, because the other thing I want you to remember from this presentation overall is that when we're talking about a new nonprofit organization, and we're talking about essentially tonight we're going to be talking about what are known as 501c3 public charities. There are lots of different kinds of nonprofit organizations, tax exempt, not tax exempt, and C3s and C1 through C29, but we're really going to focus on what most people mean when they say nonprofit. They mean a 501c3 public charity. So there's two components. There's always two components to a 501c3 public charity: the state component and the federal component. And that's why we call this doing the two-step. And it's both components in the setup and in the operation, the ongoing operation. So this slide talks about doing the two-step, and the first thing you do, even before you do that first step, which is the state step, is you plan. You will reap unceasing benefits from taking the time to craft a plausible and a persuasive business plan for your undertaking, for whether it's going to end up as a new entity or not, even if it's going to be somehow a program sponsored by someone else, a fiscal sponsor, we'll talk a little bit about that, or you're going to offer to be the manager of this activity for some existing entity. A plan is what you need. And the idea of the plan is that you should be able to give that to someone who knows nothing about you or what you're planning to do or the organization. They should be able to read it and have a very good idea of what we're talking about from that one document. And that's the business plan. So there are a variety of places that you can get help in creating a business plan. But from the professional's point of view, from the legal point of view, and tonight's presentation is definitely focused on the nuts and bolts of the legal processes. That plan is absolutely critical. It's also how your advisors, your volunteers, your board members, your funders, your regulators, it's how everybody can get to know you, how they will evaluate you, it's how they will be most helpful, most efficiently. I'm going to quickly, I don't talk to the slides. These slides are designed just by way of information for you to use kind of as a reference point. So I'm not going to kind of read the slides. You can read them yourself. I do want to just kind of quickly point out the main issues from each slide and then kind of move forward. So if we go too fast, please do, take note of your questions as we go along, throw them in the chat or scribble them down, and then we can try, if we don't get to them during the course of the presentation, we can definitely see if there's ways in consultations, if that's possible for everyone, to get those questions addressed. So on this checklist here, you see the plan, most important. Step 1, formation. You got to create at the state level the entity, the legal entity. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about alternatives, as the Assemblywoman indicated, to doing that, because when you do that, you've created a vehicle for which, a legal entity for which you are then responsible. And it's complicated. It's more complicated for a nonprofit to, dissolve or to wind up than it is for a for-profit, for example, where you can just kind of abandon it. Then there's a few steps after you've taken that first state step of creating the entity, where you organize the entity. You get an employer identification number, for example, from the IRS. You meet as a board for the first time, and you take a bunch of initial actions like authorizing getting an EIN and authorizing applying for tax-exempt status and authorizing a bank account and adopting your bylaws, and all of those steps that just kind of set the corporation up and ready to run. The next step is registration with the Attorney General, or sometimes that's delayed, as we'll talk about, and you go straight into applying for tax-exempt status, if that's the route that you're going to take. And we'll talk about whether or not you actually want to do that, and if you do want to do it, the options for doing that. Then at the end, so that's step number 2. That's doing the two-step, the state step. And then step number 2 is the federal step. That's the application to the IRS for the recognition as a 501c3. Again, 501c3 public charity. There's other kinds of 501c3s, but we're not going to talk about those. And then after you've completed that step with the IRS, if you haven't already registered with the state, you need to do that for sure, registering with the Charities Bureau at the state level. And then there's a few additional exemptions, tax exemptions, that a New York nonprofit corporation normally secures at both the state level, and if you're in New York City, at the city level as well. And then we'll try and touch just a little bit on what the periodic filings, the reportings are, just so that you stay in good status. And then we are remembering that all of this is very iterative, and that you will always be taking all of the information that you're generating and creating and feeding it back into this plan. This plan is not a static document. It's a living document. As your roadmap, is how you function, is how you operate. And so you go back again to the plan, and whatever's coming out of that plan by way of recommendations will feed into further corporate actions as you implement your programs. So that's your second takeaway, really, is the idea that this is a 2-step setup, and both in setup and in the ongoing environment. Okay, I'm going to skip over this slide. This really just tells you again kind of the importance of that plan, how it feeds into every aspect of what you're doing, and how you're going to use it again and again and again and again. One of the biggest things for you will be, as a nonprofit public charity, fundraising, raising funds, development. And your business plan, you will extract pieces of information from that business plan, and they will drop them straight into those fundraising proposals that you're going to be submitting. And that's how you will present yourself to those funders. You'll extract information from your business plan into those reports to funders that you're going to be required to deliver. And again, all of this is kind of intermingled and iterative, so that you will always have a very up-to-date and active business plan. It has an operations side, the business plan, and it has the strategic side, where you're kind of looking forward a little bit and evaluating how you want to adjust, direction, etc. But again, you need to have the plan for all of the stakeholders that you will be encountering. Maybe not so much the business plan for your beneficiaries, your program beneficiaries. They perhaps don't need to know this information, but everybody else does. Your volunteers do, your staff does, your management does, your board of directors does, your funders do, your regulators do. They all have interest in information that would be in your business plan. All right. I'm not going to talk about developing a business plan. That's a whole other subject altogether. Unfortunately, can't cover that. I will just point you in the direction of this resource offered by Candid, another nonprofit organization that provides technical assistance to nonprofits. They have an excellent a webinar or offering which talks literally about creating the business plan and using the business plan. This is just directly from their materials, so kudos to them. I just want to show you that these are the elements, the major elements that will be in your business plan. And I often hear from people that the mission, vision, values, and the statement of need components may be programs and services. Those are the easy parts. The hard part for a lot of people is the finances, the budgeting, and understanding the market analysis, the environment, the field scan, and then making sure that they get the right people, understanding who should be doing the work that you're describing you want to do. Marketing, outreach, communications, again, there's lots of resources, both offered by the Nonprofit Help Desk itself here at the JCC and other places that I would very much want to direct you to. While I'm talking, I'll just refer to the last slide, or the second to last slide in this presentation, which also has links, just 3 links to additional resources. If we get a chance, we'll quickly look at those, but there's a lot of resources at each of those links. You have to navigate around a little bit when you click through. But for example, if you're looking for forms or information or instructions, they're all there. So a lot of your questions could probably be answered if you take the time, as you should, to read all of that, navigate all. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to set up and run one of these organizations, as I'm sure you're all very well aware. Let's talk a little bit then about what you might want to think about as opposed to setting up a nonprofit corporation. Given that it has all of these additional kind of administrative and structural needs, a business plan essentially, and all the elements of a business plan, what other way might you be able to go about trying to do what you're seeking to do, to accomplish the impact that's motivating you to set up this nonprofit or to think about setting up a nonprofit? Well, here's just 4 ways that you could possibly, and you should definitely think about them all as alternatives to setting up your own nonprofit or setting up a new nonprofit. It's not good to call it your own nonprofit. One would be, of course, just to volunteer with an organization that's doing similar work, or find a job with them. You might find that you can, in fact, achieve a lot of what you're trying to achieve in those environments. Board service is another excellent way to do that. Again, if you are actually looking to keep control of a specific program that you're looking to initiate, fiscal sponsorship is another way. So let's just take a moment to talk about what fiscal sponsorship actually means. I think we skipped the first poll. Jill, do you want to launch the first poll and we'll quickly get an answer to that one, and then we'll come back to this one? Okay. So I just want to see who's here today, if you don't mind. If you could all just take a look at this poll and start looking to answer that question. We will take a look at those results in just a minute or so. And then actually, Joel, I'll probably actually ask you to launch a second one as well once I have the results here.
Yeah, okay. Happy to do it. Don't be shy, please contribute so we know exactly where everybody is in their journey around nonprofits.
Right.
We'll give it another 10 seconds or so.
Yeah, absolutely. Not much more than that because we've got to keep going, I'm afraid.
Okay. So I think, Neil, more than half the people, offered their thinking here. And it looks like, the majority are looking to start and really haven't really begun the process too much. There are a few who are further advanced along the way, and we actually have 3 that have established a 501c3.
Okay.
So when we get to talking a little bit more about what that's like, hopefully they can share some of their experiences with us as well.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So that's helpful. That means that the vast majority of you are in the right place in terms of what we're offering today. Those of you who already have a C3 with your tax exempt status, you may find this a little simple, a little elemental for your needs. And so, to the extent that you have questions that are kind of beyond what we're talking about today, we hopefully will be able to find another way to help you in that. Okay, if you don't mind, Jill, go ahead and launch the second poll. I just want to see how many people here. And these are questions that we kind of asked in the registration. And thank you all for those of you who completed the questions when you were registering. I appreciate that. It matches up pretty closely to what I thought we were going to have by way of an audience. Okay, so yes, the vast majority. Okay, this is actually better, and because in the registration results we saw that approximately 80% of the registrants did not have a business plan. The answer to that question, do you have a business plan? Yes or no. The answer was no from 80%. We didn't offer the working on it, and I'm very glad to see that when we offer this option, working on it takes up almost 50% plus the 30% who said no. That's very, and 20% is in fact the same percentage as said yes in the original question. Excellent, because you should never be answering that question no, as you just heard me say. You should always either have a business plan or you should be definitely working on it. In fact, the answer should probably be yes, I have a plan, and yes, I'm working on it. Thank you, Jill. That's great. Let's move right along. Okay, so we said that step one was the, let me see, catch up on my paper here. The formation and incorporation at the state level. And so just to be absolutely clear, this is at the point that you've decided that you are going to form a new nonprofit organization. You know, how do you actually do that? That's what we're really going to focus on today. Those are the questions that we are seeking to give you the information about. Can we get rid of that poll result? There we go. That's me. So to answer one of the questions, somebody asked a question on the registration, you know, what do I think about incorporating when forming, or do you need to incorporate? Because the IRS actually offers a lot of information about how to submit to the IRS without being an incorporated entity. The answer is varies, of course, because we're talking about the state level. It varies state by state. In New York, there is no such thing as an unincorporated association. It's not recognized as a legal entity, unlike, for example, in California and a few other states where there actually it is possible to be recognized as a legal entity as an unincorporated association. It is true that at step two, at the federal level, you can be recognized by the IRS as tax-exempt, a 501c3 public charity, as an unincorporated association if you have the right kind of paperwork. In New York, because there's no such thing really, there's really only one vehicle that is available to be recognized as a nonprofit in New York, and that is the New York Nonprofit Corporation. The other reason, besides the fact that New York doesn't recognize unincorporated associations that you want to incorporate, is essentially for the limited liability protection of having a corporation. It's more about that than anything to do with kind of governance or administration. It's really more about protecting the participants in that nonprofit through the shield, the limited liability shield that a nonprofit corporation or any corporation or kind of other legal entity provides. That's why if you operate as kind of an unincorporated entity in New York, what you're really doing is you're operating as a partnership, as a general partnership. And that means that everybody is jointly and severally liable for everybody else. And that is not something that is generally recommended. And so you are generally advised to use a vehicle if in fact you are not going to use fiscal sponsorship or find some other way to pursue your mission. Before I talk just a little bit about what fiscal sponsorship actually involves, I want to throw it back to Arisa and just ask Arisa what her thinking was around the creation of the corporation when she created NAC, and did she ever find a situation where she was glad, in fact, from that liability perspective, that in fact she had gone through the steps to create that entity? Arisa?
Yeah, well, when creating NAC, I didn't see any other real option that fit me at that time, but limited liability corporation, knowing that I would be, I wouldn't be liable if anything happened. But I've never really come up against anything where I had to use that, to fall back on that, any type of suits or anything like that. But having that type of setup the LLC, as well as the regular insurance and things of that nature, also is always good just to have for the organization.
Thank you, Rita.
You're welcome.
That's absolutely critical. And I will reference just as Rita just did, the insurance question, particularly directors and officers insurance as part of the general liability insurance, a very important factor. And it goes to both your own kind of protection and the use and proper constitution of the corporation, as well as the individual directors and volunteers in your organization who are going to expect, if not require, you to have that kind of insurance as well. So those two things together, the limited liability that comes with the corporation and the adequate insurance to deal with the processes of dealing with claims, whether there's any liability ultimately or not. It's more about dealing with the claim than actually satisfying any liability. That's where the insurance factor comes in. Okay, so before we get into the more detail on the actual mechanics of, the filings with the state under this step one, this formation and incorporation step, let's just take a pause and quickly talk about fiscal sponsorship. If I can get my screen to work, there we go. So what is fiscal sponsorship? How is it different? It's essentially where a project, that's you thinking about undertaking some kind of activity and possibly forming your own nonprofit. As an alternative, that project talks to an existing 501c3 entity, and that's the sponsor, and asks the sponsor to lend their 501c3 status so that the project can raise funds. So money comes in, donors and contributors and grant makers give the money to this sponsor, but there's an agreement between the sponsor and the project whereby the sponsor is only taking that money in order to pass it over to the project. There's a bunch of requirements around that, and the key is to understand that you simply need to have an agreement there in place that defines how it will work. But it is permissible, is the point. And the big advantage of that is that the project then, has not formed a new corporation, a new entity, and therefore doesn't have a new entity to administer or report on or worry about insurance, etc. necessarily. It can depend upon exactly how the sponsor and the project set up the arrangement, but that's one of the most direct advantages of a particular form of fiscal sponsorship. And the other, of course, is that the project can immediately focus on program and fundraising and not have to worry about all of that administrative type of headache. How do you go about that? How do you find a fiscal sponsor? There's a resource here on the slide. You can check that out. If you go to Candid, again, there's a bunch of resources on their website which talk about fiscal sponsorship and how to both find a fiscal sponsor and how to think about setting up the relationship. And it's the kind of assistance that you can find generally for a nonprofit, because it's very common and actually recommended for a startup. You'll be able to develop a track record with that sponsor that you will then be able to use when you want to no longer have the sponsor. And for example, if you're successful, if you've been sponsored for a couple of years, for example, you've got a couple of years of operational history that will help you in your application to the IRS. They'll be able to look at it and see exactly who you are and what you do. And it makes that application go much more smoothly through the IRS. And it will also answer questions for you about, oh, is this really what I thought it was going to be? Is this really what I want to do? Okay, I'll form my own nonprofit and be independent. I understand you will much better after a couple of years how to run this program, whether it's in a new entity or under the auspices of the fiscal sponsor. So that's fiscal sponsorship as a very real and very practical, if not advisable or recommended alternative to creating your own new nonprofit. Okay, back quickly to the formation and incorporation. Step one, this is still the state level. you have a couple of choices. If you're going to be ultimately you're going to go after you form the entity at the state level to the IRS and say, please recognize me as a 501c3 public charity. You don't really have this first choice, this charitable or non-charitable choice. That is a choice for a New York nonprofit corporation. You remember I said there's only one vehicle that you can use in New York State. That's a New York nonprofit corporation. A New York nonprofit corporation can be either charitable or non-charitable. If you go to the link at the end of this presentation and you go to the New York State Division of Corporations website and you look at the form for nonprofit corporation, you'll see that in there. That's something that you need to do. If you're going to be a 501c3 public charity, you have to be charitable, which, as you would expect. Non-charitable is for things like a block association or a social club, and something that's not charitable, but that is tax exempt. They don't pay income taxes, but they also can't receive charitable contributions that people can take off their taxes. They also are not going to receive grant-making type funding either from the city or from the state or from foundations, because they will only give to 501c3 public charities, nobody else. And so you will be charitable, and you do this first step. You also have a choice in this first step at the state level, the certificate of incorporation, members or no members. Big discussion there. Generally speaking, unless you really need members, voting members, the recommendation is don't do it. You can find other ways to give people kind of buy-in and transparency and accountability without literally making others voting members. But it's a big discussion and probably beyond the scope of today's presentation. Just think of the recommendations being, let's stick with no members unless we can really give a good reason why we have to have members. And then I want to just talk about how these corporations work, just very quickly. This last bullet point here is this slide here. If you have members, it's slightly grayed out. And they are the people who elect the board of directors. The board of directors are the people who appoint the officers. That's like the chair or the president or the CEO or the treasurer and the secretary or the executive director. Those are the officers. Those are the people who have kind of executive decision-making authority for the operations, as opposed to the board of directors who do it for the kind of strategy and the vision and the mission. And of course, with a small organization, these are often the same people. People wear more than one hat. They can be a director. You can also be the treasurer, but they don't have to be. And you have to have a board of directors. You don't have to have any officers, but it's very common, and it just clarifies things for other people. And then the officers supervise and hire staff and volunteers. So that's just, this little graphic is just to show you how those various titles of people that you will hear about interact. This is the hierarchy here. So quickly, here's more information about how you actually would create that certificate of incorporation and file it. I will pick up on something that Jill has said time and time again, which is the best way that this works is for you to look at all of this information, to, for example, go to this link to pull down that form of New York Nonprofit Corporation Certificate of Incorporation and fill it out or mark your questions on it. And then before you file it, bring it to the lawyer or bring it to the advisor and have them go through it with you, answer your questions and check it over before you file it, because it's easier to and most efficient to do it that way than to try to correct mistakes that maybe make their way into those documents if you try to do them completely by yourself. You also, though, on the flip side, you shouldn't expect that the lawyer or your advisor is just going to do all of this for you. That's not the way to approach it either. You need to learn and understand, and there's a ton of information there that you can go and spend time with and read and review, and then get to a point yourself where you have questions, but you're kind of ready to go and you're just looking for the blessing or the kind of the green light from the professional. So you prepare the certificate of incorporation. You have to have 3 directors. That's a minimum in New York, and you must name them in the certificate to file them. That can get changed later, but you have to have 3 day one. And thereafter, you must keep 3 at least minimum. We can talk about the variations of how that happens. Somebody resigns, you have to replace them. For a month or so, you have only 2. That's okay. But the bottom line is you're supposed to have 3. And if you are found certificate of incorporation and you're going to go onto the IRS, there's additional language that must go into that certificate of incorporation because the IRS will ask you if it's there, and you will, and we'll get to that when we get to the 1023. I'm just looking at my time. We're running desperately short of time here. Okay, so that's step one. File a certificate of incorporation, and then this next step immediately after that, still at the state level, still at the corporation level, you have to have this last bullet point, first organizational meeting. That's where the 3 people or more that you've named in the certificate as your directors have a meeting. And at that meeting, they take all the initial actions that set up the corporation. For example, they adopt the bylaws. They adopt the conflict of interest policy, which is mandated. You must have one under the law in New York. They authorize the corporation to apply for an EIN. They authorize the corporation to apply for tax exemption. You know, they decide who's going to be the officers. They decide whatever other programmatic activity the corporation is going to undertake. You know, it's going to open a bank account, whatever it's going to do. That all goes in those initial minutes, those initial resolutions at the organizational meeting. And that's how the corporation functions going forward. You call board meetings and the board authorizes actions, you know, after discussion and etc. The board makes decisions and then management implements those decisions. That's how the corporation works. And it's important that you make it work that way and you keep the records that way, because that's how you comply with and are able to take advantage of the limited liability shield. If you don't do it correctly, that shield will go away, or you risk that that shield will go away and that you become personally liable for what should be the obligations of the corporation. Okay, quick question, poll number 3, if you would, Jill. Have you ever served on the board of a nonprofit corporation? I'm just trying to see how many people here have that experience. You go ahead and answer that quickly. Then I'm going to race through. Okay, so almost 2/3 no, and a third yes. Okay, critical. I'm almost tempted to say that if you haven't been on the board of a nonprofit corporation, I wouldn't, unless you have other kind of board experience or other, you know, startup experience of starting up your own business or something, I would say it might be a very good first step to volunteer on a nonprofit board. You'll learn a ton as to how these things are really working in practice. And it will inform a lot of what you decide to do about setting up your own entity or even taking your program to a fiscal sponsor. Okay, thank you, Jill. I appreciate that.
Neil, we had a couple of questions, and it's a little out of order, so we can defer them to the end, but it was about fiscal sponsorship and what the cost might be in terms of pursuing fiscal sponsorship versus forming a nonprofit, and also how do you find a nonprofit that would be willing to be your fiscal sponsor?
Okay, so I'll take the first one first. There's no cost generally. It's just a contract. So, you know, each side bears their own cost with respect to if there are costs involved in creating that contract. It is true that most, not all though, most fiscal sponsors impose a fee in terms of the amount of money that comes in. They'll take 5%. If you raise, you know, $50,000, they'll take 5% of that by way of an administration expense. It's not meant to be a moneymaker, fiscal sponsorship, even for those sponsors that operate that as a program. Is really meant to just cover their costs because it's mission for them to be a fiscal sponsor. So you could be very lucky and find a 501c3 sponsor who doesn't charge a fee at all, and so there could be no cost there. But usually there is a fee because there is an administrative cost for the sponsor, and that's part of the point. You don't have that cost. They do. So it's reasonable for you to share a little bit of the funds that you raise to cover their costs. And that's negotiable, of course. The point about where do you find it, if you look at the slide, there's a link there which talks about how to find, going through the foundation directories, and there's more information about how to find a fiscal sponsor and the need for the proper matchup on the Candid website. And that's one of the resources at the very end. So I encourage you to dig through those resources. And I have a question for Arisa actually on this point too. Arisa, on the board, serving on the nonprofit board, did you have a lot of difficulty, or what was your experience in terms of trying to attract and recruit board members and then have people serve on the board at NAC?
Yes, so when we started, being that my organization was so dear to my heart, I reached out to those that were directly around me and kind of had the same heart. But I also looked for those that brought in what I didn't know. So like from the financial aspect and, managerial, different things like that. And we have expanded our board over the years to bring in others that have more experience in the nonprofit industry that can guide us just a little bit further, so that our organization is not just looked at as a mom and son organization, but helping us to get the capacity and the infrastructure to attain other things outside of what our usual lens gives us.
Thank you. I think
You're welcome.
Those are very, very valid points that Lisa's making, because it's the composition of your board is one of the first things that third parties are going to look at, funders in particular, are going to look at to get a sense of kind of who you are and what you are bringing to the table as an organization. So what Lisa is just describing in terms of where you find them in the first place, but then the ongoing project of developing your board is never ending, is very, very important. It's something that you would have in your business plan and your strategic plan in terms of how you go about that. Again, there are resources, links to the resources at the end. Board Source is a place where you can literally advertise for board members. But I just want to emphasize, as Arisa just did, is that the composition of your board is very indicative of the quality, the credibility of your organization, especially for a startup. It goes both ways. Startups are small, hard to attract people when there's no track record there, which is why you start with the people closest around you. But even there, you're looking to see what skills they can bring, what value they can bring to the mission of the nonprofit. It's not just your friends and people that you know. Okay. Bylaws, we talked a little bit about this. This is just one of the governing documents. I'm not going to talk a little bit about this, but people often ask about there. It's a process to put these into place, and it does deal with the operation, the internal decision-making of the entity, but I'm not going to talk about the detailed provisions of the bylaws. Just know that you should have them. It helps to have them. Not technically, strictly, not really a legal requirement. If you don't have them, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do. So you might as well have them. It's helpful. This you do have to have. You have to have a written conflict of interest policy as mandated under the New York not-for-profit corporation law. And it really is just there to specify, to lay out the procedure for managing conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest don't mean you can't do the deal. You can't take the space from the director who's going to be the landlord. You can, but you have to recognize that there's a conflict of interest there. That person has interest on both sides as a director and as a landlord. So you have to resolve that. That's what the conflict of interest policy does. And again, you can see lots of examples of that. If you want to take a look at the example that the IRS actually offers in its instructions, that's a good place to start. It doesn't quite match up with the New York law. And so you want to, if you're a New York nonprofit corporation, you have to kind of massage that a little bit. But that can all be done in order to get you a conflict of interest policy that you understand and that you adhere to. There's nothing worse than having a policy that's there and you ignore it, you violate it. That's really asking for trouble. So you need to have the policy, you need to actually adhere to it, which means there's an annual process of disclosure and review. We're into step 2, and how far behind am I? I am catching up on my paper. We're a little bit behind. Okay, this is the federal step. Okay, so you've now created the New York corporation, nonprofit corporation. You've got it set up. You've done all of those bits and pieces. One of the things was to authorize application to the IRS for recognition as 501c3 public charity. That's essentially what we're talking about. How do you do that? The corporation files a form. And it's the corporation that signs it. An authorized officer of the corporation will sign this form. And you need to decide which way you're going to apply. Recently, about 6 years ago, the IRS brought out a simple application. It's called the 1023. 1023 is just the number of the form, the 1023 EZ. And as opposed to the original, when there was just the one option, the full 1023 form. 1023 EZ basically is for smaller startup type nonprofits. So it'll probably cover a lot of you. You have to be able to say that you don't expect revenues on average over the first 3 years to be more than 50,000, and that you don't have assets of more than 250,000. That covers the vast majority. And that was the purpose, was to make this cover the vast majority of these kind of startup nonprofits. Just know that if you go through this process with the IRS, you apply for recognition and you do not successfully complete it, you now have a New York nonprofit corporation at the state level, step one. If you don't get recognition of tax-exempt status, then you're not tax-exempt and you're taxable. And therefore, you still have the entity, and so you still have to file returns, and you can't just abandon it and walk away from it. You have to figure out what to do with that entity. It will be a for-profit taxpayer, that nonprofit corporation. So you want to make sure you complete this process, the step two, with the IRS and get the tax-exempt status. And you don't have to apply at all, this first bullet point, if you're really small. If you're going to stay less than $5,000 a year in revenues, you can what they call self-certify as a 501c3 public charity. You still need to file annual reports, etc., but you don't have to file an application. The big disadvantage, because even some who do qualify for the self-certification, they're like a neighborhood, park beautification cleanup type organization. They want to have tax deductible contributions, etc. That's how they get their money, but they're never going to have more than 5,000. Even groups like that, though, do file. You don't have to, but they do, because you're not going to have any official recognition that you can give to a third party unless you file. So the self-certification thing may work in a very, very local basis where there's not a lot at stake. But as soon as you are going to go to a larger funder who is not totally kind of local or knows you kind of personally, it's just not going to work. And you're going to want that letter, that what they call the determination letter from the IRS. So I have to acknowledge that you can do it that way, but we don't see it very often. And even the ones that start out that way, soon they decide that they want to get the formal recognition. Okay.
Neil, can I ask a question? If you start out with the EZ form and then suddenly you're sort of maturing as an organization and you see that you have the opportunity to raise more money, can you then become, do you need to go back and fill out the other form? How do you jump from that category to the fuller category?
No, good question, Joe. And we're going to come to that as part of that in just one second. But that's a good question. No, you don't have to file again. If you get recognition with the EZ, as long as you, in fact, accurately are eligible for that, and that's a whole kind of preliminary process that you go through to make sure that you can use the 1023 EZ, that you're the right size, etc. You don't, once you get bigger, you do not have to file again in terms of the application. You'll be reporting on your 990, and the IRS will see that you're bigger and that you, but as long as you were accurate and you didn't have more than 50,000 on average over those first 3 years, they're not going to ask you to file again. But I do want to come back to that question as to the distinction between the two and why, even if you're eligible to use the EZ, you might not want to use it. But we'll come back to it in just one second. Here, I just want to remind everybody of what it means to be a tax-exempt nonprofit. There are certain things you cannot do. And so you, again, business plan all the way back, want to make sure that whatever it is you have in view by way of activities, you're not going to have problems doing those things as a 1020, as a 501c3. Most common one is the prohibition on political activity. No political activity. None. No candidate endorsement, and no, you can do general things like voter, get out the vote type things, registration, but no associating specifically pro or con with a particular elected politician or candidate. Lobbying activity, understand that you can lobby, but it's limited. It can't be the main thing that you do. And lobbying means literally talking to an elected about legislation. It doesn't mean advocacy or education. You can do that unlimitedly. What you can't do is talk to an elected and say, change this rule or bring in this legislation. That's lobbying. So those are the main limitations on 501c3 public charities. Those are the kind of quid pro quos that you give for that tax-exempt, taxable, tax-deductible contributions benefit. Okay, I'm going to quickly run on. So we talked about how you do the 1023-EZ. It only costs $275, and it's quicker to process. You can get recognition through in possibly 2 months, 8 weeks from application. So that's very quick. It's a little, I think it's a little slower at the moment with the pandemic. You don't hand over a bunch of information that you do have to hand over with the big form. But this cuts both ways. When you don't put that information in there, when it's really essentially, again, a kind of a self-certification application, you're simply answering the right question. You're answering the questions on the form the right way, and the IRS is kind of going to automatically give you your C3 status. It means that there's not much public information about you on file. And that's not a good thing when people are looking to get to know you. The 1023 is a much bigger form. It requires a lot of information. It requires your organization documents to be submitted. It costs more. It takes longer. Both forms are submitted online, and only online these days. It costs $600 to file the full 1023. But the upside, and here's the tip, is that with the full 1023, although it's a pain to prepare it and it takes longer to process it, there's information in there that is very valuable to third parties. They like to see it. They like to see why you have C3 status. And so they don't see that in the 1023-EZ. There's nothing to review in the 1023-EZ. And so you should think about that trade-off, and that you might still want to use a full 1023 in order to create that public record that is actually your opportunity to kind of, it's like a marketing tool, just like the 990s are a marketing tool. It's what other people look at to know who you are as a nonprofit organization. And you can put in all the good stuff there that makes you look great and makes you look attractive. And that is what a funder or a stakeholder is going to look at first. Before they look at your information or your proposal, they're going to look at that background information. So think about whether or not, even if you're eligible to use the 1023-EZ, you might want to still file the full 1023. If you don't, and you do file the 1023-EZ, we highly recommend that you still complete the full 1023 and keep it in your own records, so that, in fact, very quickly, if anybody were to ask, you could produce it. You could simply say, well, here's what I would have filed if I were going to file a full 1023. And that way you file the 1023-EZ, it's cheaper, it's quicker, but if anybody wants more information, you can give them the full 1023. That's the compromise, and it's very advisable. I will just also add that if there's a problem with your 1023-EZ, let's just say you file it, and then all of a sudden you have revenues of $500,000, well in excess of the limit, what we've found is the IRS will come back, and what they will say in the first instance is, please explain, why did you file the EZ when you clearly weren't eligible, since you just, had $500,000 worth of revenues? And then they will say, they won't revoke your status, but what they will say is, now please give us a full 1023. So in any event, you might want to have it there just for circumstances of that sort. Okay, running along because we're going to run out of time very shortly. Don't forget, if you've done the first step one and then you've done the IRS part, but you didn't register with the Charities Bureau, because the Charities Bureau registration requires you to say, do you have C3 status or not? So people often wait until they've completed and gotten the determination letter from the IRS, and then they register with the Charities Bureau. So they only have to register kind of once, as opposed to registering once and then having to send in the determination letter later when they get it. Make sure you register. One, either early on or immediately after you have that determination. And there are other factors that go into deciding whether or not you should delay that registration, because technically you should register the minute you've created the corporation, the minute you start soliciting and the minute you start administering charitable assets. And again, there's a lot of information about that registration and annual reporting on that website there. I'm going to quickly run through. These are the other exemptions that we mentioned at the beginning. state and local sales and use tax, New York State corporate franchise tax, and if you're in New York City, based in New York City, operating in New York City business corporation tax, you should be exempt from all of these. They require separate applications to get yourself exempt. It's important because later on, when you're doing anything, as your entity has grown and gotten more sophisticated, those statuses will come up, and you want to have them, properly established. One last thing I will say is that remember that the minute you have C3 status, and in fact, even possibly before, and that's a very kind of complicated question, but I don't think we have time to go into, you must file a 990 of some sort, of the appropriate size, the appropriate 990 for your size. At the very least, you need to file that 990N postcard. If you don't file it for 3 years in a row, you're just automatically revoked. Your status, you lose your C3 status, and you have to go through a whole process to get it reinstated. So make sure you're filing something. And going back to step one, the minute you create that corporation, that's an entity that has a tax year, just as you as an individual have the calendar year as your tax year. That entity has a tax year. The default is the calendar year, but you can pick a 12-month period. And that means you have a deadline to file something from that point on. Make sure you figure out what you're going to file and then file it, because you don't want to run the risk of revocation. This is just a chart which shows which 990 you can file. You can always file the more advanced 990, you can file a full form 990, but you have an option to file smaller. If you're smaller, you can file the simpler forms. The Charities Bureau, that's the federal filing. The state filing, again, step one, step two, this is step one, and the state filing, you have a CHAR 500 is the form that you file every year. The state is the one that has audit requirements. The feds do not have audit requirements, and your audit requirements depends upon what size you are. You have to be between 250 and 750,000 a year to have an audit, to have a financial information accountant's requirement, and above 750,000, which is about to go up to $1 million this year, for an actual audit. You have to file some kind of financial information, no matter what size you are. With the state. The IRS, if you're less than 50,000 and you're filing the 990N, there's no financial information required. Okay, these are the 3 links. On each of these links, you will find a lot more information about all of the things we just talked about. And so I very much encourage you that you go there and just dig around and look to see kind of what you can find. And what I want to do before I hand this back to Jill for the kind of close up and the housekeeping wrap up, I just want to give it back to Risa one last time, if she has kind of a takeaway thought as the founder, as somebody who's nursed a nonprofit along for, I think it's 10 years at this point, Risa. What would you say to somebody who's just thinking of establishing something at this point?
Yeah, it'll be almost 14 years, Neil. I know it's been a while. You guys, Lawyers Alliance, actually helped me on the ground. And I just want to say, take advantage of all the resources that's out there for you. Not-for-profit help desk and all the other resources that Neil has given you this evening. You do not have to reinvent the wheel. I think a lot of times it just seems, it is a lot, but it can be more if you try to do it from scratch. If you take advantage of the conflict of interest policies that's out there and create it and shape it to what your needs are, that really helps as well. And the other thing is, I saw that a lot of you guys are on here because you did come to the conclusion that you want to start a 501c3. As soon as you can, apply for that exemption. I didn't do it until years later, and the information that they asked for, had I received monies and where was it spent, and just the programs and services, it took more time than what it should have. If that is the route you're going to go, just apply for your 501c3 designation as soon as possible. The last thing I want to say is, as much as you are the owner of your organization, you are not the owner. So when you do a 501c3, it is for the community. Your board makes decisions that you may not like, but you are the owner, but not the owner. And so as a founder, I've had to come to terms with some things that was better for the beneficial of the community and for the organization. So just keep those things in mind, and I wish you all the absolute best.
Thank you so much, Rita. I appreciate those words of wisdom. And I'm just going to hand it back to Jill for some last minute housekeeping.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Neil. Everybody can hear me? All right, this was an unbelievable crash course. Neil, thank you for going through all of that material. As everybody can tell, there's a two-step process, and each stage of the process has several different iterations to it. And I think, the takeaway, as Arisa just said, is that there are resources out there. This is not something that you need to do on your own. It's a methodical stage process, and there's a step-by-step process that you can follow to get this work done. And there are a lot of resources. And please, if you want to think about doing this, the best advice is also to get somebody who believes in the work that you're doing, who can be a partner with you and sharing the work that needs to happen. So you're not doing it all your own, because having a thought partner and somebody who's in there with you is really very, very helpful. I want to thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedule to join us. We are going to be posting a recording of the session. We also will be emailing you out the slide deck, so you will have access to the live links and you can take a look at that. And we'll post that ultimately on our website as well. Please look out for an email from us. Hopefully I'll get it out tomorrow. It's going to include a feedback survey. We'd love to get your feedback. If this crash course suggests that you'd like to delve into this on a slower pace over a couple of different sessions, give us that feedback, because we can structure something like that as well. We want to be helpful to you. And the other piece, though, is that we do have an opportunity for you to take advantage of some limited one-on-one consulting. Neil is available depending on the issues that you're trying to grapple with as they relate to becoming a nonprofit organization. If you have particular questions, answer the survey. It's a form where you can apply for one-on-one consulting, and we will get back to you very quickly. The more information you can provide to us about what you're looking to do, what the status is of your efforts in starting a nonprofit, we can do some homework in advance of talking to you and be prepared to make sure that we're best using our time together. So I encourage you to do that. So we hope to hear from you. Thank you again. Thanks to all of our sponsors, Assemblywoman Frontis. Thanks for hanging in there. I don't know how much people understand about her trajectory, but she had started a nonprofit. She well understands the trials and tribulations of going through this. But at the end of the day, as I said in the beginning, the JCC of Greater Coney Island was founded 40 years ago, and they are still here, and they're a huge enterprise right now. Arisa, you said you were started 14 plus years ago, and look how far you've come. So there are a lot of examples out there where people stayed the course, did the investment and did the work, and they're doing unbelievably important work in the community. But as Neil said in the beginning, and I really feel it's important to reiterate, this isn't the only pathway forward. If you have an incredibly good idea and you want to be of service, there are additional ways you can think about doing that. And it's not at the end of the day an either or proposition. It's not, if I choose this, I can't do that. You can try and move down a path and have some experience while pursuing 501c3. And the fiscal sponsorship is a very good example of that. You get your feet wet, you're in service to the community, you're getting your ducks in order, you're putting your advisory committee together that then can transition to being a board of directors. So there are intermediate steps that you can build along the way that will ultimately get you to 501c3 if you decide that that's the best decision, not only for you, because you're the ones that are going to have to do the work and provide the leadership, but in service to the community, because again, as a charity, that's what this is all about. So thanks for hanging in there a little later. I see we have a couple of other questions in the chat, so thank you all for your feedback. If there are a couple of names, honestly, that I didn't recognize, I was trying to take attendance. So before you leave, if you didn't register or somebody else passed you the registration link, do me a favor and just type your email in the chat so we know how to get in touch with you. So you'll have the advantage of getting all these resource materials and the chance to sign up for a one-on-one. Assemblywoman Frontis, is there anything else you want to add in closing?
I was typing a message, but thank you so much. I just was going to say thank you to JCC. Thank you to the Nonprofit Help Desk. In the spirit of transparency, I'd be remiss if I didn't reminisce that in 2008, when I first moved into my first headquarters for a nonprofit that I had founded since 2004. When we started in 2004, we started in a church basement. And 4 years later, I would have my first office. In fact, it was the Nonprofit Help Desk, which I found out about, which was right here in the Coney Island community, which sent a consultant over to help me with my organization, to get us on QuickBooks, to teach us everything we needed to know. It's been a long journey of working together with the Nonprofit Help Desk, and it's amazing to see now in 2021, we are here working together in another capacity. So I just wanted to acknowledge how we've all come full circle and to serve as a witness that you guys have been doing really great work for a very long time here in Southern Brooklyn. So thank you for all of that. Thank you for what you continue to do. For all of you who were here today, thank you for the kind comments in the chats. I'm seeing lots of people saying that this was helpful to them. And I guess I would say to let's stay in touch and keep an eye out for other happenings, both through the Nonprofit Help Desk, and certainly follow me on social media, call our office, and find out what else we have going on. Thank you.
And thank you so much too.
Everybody have a great night. Take good care. Bye-bye.